The moment I satisfies the words, DNA analysis confirms no Hebrew ancestry in Native American populations, I understood why my husband had stopped praying with me. I was standing in his office at 2 a.m, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, holding a document I was never supposed to find. The paper trembled in my hands, not from the December chill seeping through the window, but from something breaking inside me. Something that had held my entire world together for 58 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the life I thought I knew, from the woman I thought I was before everything unraveled. My name is Margaret Holloway, and for 35 years I was the wife of David Holloway, professor of ancient history at Brigham Young University. We lived in a modest brick home on a quiet street in Provo, Utah, close enough to the temple that I could see its white spire from my kitchen window every morning while I prepared breakfast. That view had been my compass, my daily reminder that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, living exactly the life Heavenly Father had planned for me. David and I met at a singles ward dance in 1989. He was finishing his doctorate, tall and serious with wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a scholar even then. I was 23, freshly returned from a mission in Argentina, burning with testimony and ready to fulfill my divine role as a wife and mother in Zion. When David asked me to dance, I felt something settle in my chest, a warmth I interpreted as the Spirit confirming that this was the man I would build eternity with. We were sealed in the Provo Temple 6 months later. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. My father, a bishop himself at the time, placed his hands on our heads and blessed us with posterity as numerous as the stars. And for 3 decades, it seemed like every promise was being fulfilled. We had 4 children. Thomas, our firstborn, served a mission in Brazil and returned with a fire for the gospel that never dimmed. He married a sweet girl named Jennifer in the Salt Lake Temple, and 5 years ago he was called as bishop of his ward in Sandy. I still remember the day he called to tell us, his voice thick with humility and awe. I wept with gratitude, thinking of all those nights I had rocked him as a baby, singing primary hymns, praying that he would grow up to be a leader in the kingdom. And there he was, Bishop Thomas Holloway, my son, the bishop. Rachel, our only daughter, married a returned missionary named Derek, and they blessed us with 3 grandchildren who called me Grammy and ran to my arms every Sunday after church. Our 2 younger sons, Michael and Peter, both served missions, Michael in Japan, Peter in the Philippines, and returned with testimonies forged in sacrifice. They were married in the temple, faithful, tithe-paying members raising their own children in the covenant. This was the life I had been promised. This was the life I had earned through decades of obedience, of early morning scripture study, of magnifying my callings, of never questioning, never doubting, never letting the adversary plant seeds of uncertainty in my heart. I served as Relief Society president in our ward for 4 years, and even after I was released, the sisters still came to me for advice. I taught gospel doctrine for nearly a decade. I hosted countless family home evenings, baked thousands of cookies for missionary farewells, spent hundreds of hours in the temple doing work for the dead. I was, by every measure the church had ever given me, a faithful Latter-day Saint woman. And David was my partner in all of it. He was the priesthood holder in our home, the one who blessed our children when they were sick, who interviewed them before their baptisms, who placed his hands on their heads before every school year and pronounced Father's blessings over them. He conducted family scripture study every night before bed, his deep voice reading from the Book of Mormon while our children sat cross-legged on the living room carpet. But David's faith was never just personal, it was professional. His entire career at BYU had been dedicated to finding evidence that supported the scriptures. He specialized in ancient Near Eastern studies, and while he was careful never to claim his work proved the Book of Mormon, there was always an unspoken understanding among the faculty that their research served a higher purpose. They weren't just academics. They were defenders of the faith using scholarship as a shield against the arrows of critics. That's why, when David came home in March of last year with news about a new research project, I saw it as a blessing. The university is partnering with some outside researchers, he told me over dinner, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement I hadn't seen in years. They're putting together a team to examine new archaeological sites in Mesoamerica. Margaret, they think they might have found something significant. What kind of something? I asked, setting down my fork. David leaned forward. Artifacts, inscriptions, things that could. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Things that could be consistent with Book of Mormon populations. My heart swelled. After all these years, after all the criticism and mockery the church had endured, here was my husband being invited to participate in research that might vindicate everything we believed. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. This is what you've been working toward your whole career, I said. He nodded, but something flickered in his eyes. Something I didn't recognize at the time. Looking back, I think it was fear. But in that moment, I only saw what I wanted to see. My faithful husband, called to serve the Lord through his scholarship. David left for his first research trip in April. He was gone for 3 weeks, and when he returned, I noticed the change immediately. He was quieter than usual, distracted during family prayer, slow to respond when I asked about his work. I assumed he was simply exhausted from the travel, from the intensity of fieldwork. He was 62 years old after all. The body doesn't recover from long flights and jungle humidity the way it used to. How was it? I asked the night he came home, sitting beside him on our bed as he unpacked his suitcase. Good, he said, not meeting my eyes. Productive. Did you find anything? He paused with a folded shirt in his hands. We found a lot of things, Margaret. It takes time to analyze everything, to understand what it means. But it's promising. Another pause. It's complicated. I waited for him to elaborate, but he simply continued unpacking in silence. That night, he didn't reach for me in bed the way he usually did after time apart. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and when I asked if something was wrong, he said he was just tired. The second trip came in June. When David returned, he was even more withdrawn. He started spending hours in his home office with the door closed, something he had never done in 35 years of marriage. I would hear him on the phone, speaking in low tones, and when I knocked to bring him dinner, he would quickly end the conversation. Who was that? I asked one evening. Just a colleague, he said. Nothing important. But everything felt important. Everything felt wrong. The third trip happened in September. David was gone for a month this time, and when he finally came home, something in him had fundamentally shifted. He moved through our house like a ghost, going through the motions of family life without actually being present. He stopped suggesting we read scriptures together before bed. He stopped praying at meals, always deferring to me or one of our visiting children. And when we attended church together, I noticed him staring at the speakers with an expression I had never seen before. Not devotion, not contemplation, but something that looked almost like grief. One Sunday in October, I found him sitting in his car in the garage after we came home from church. The engine was off, and he was just sitting there, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. When I opened the passenger door, I saw tears on his cheeks. David? I slid into the seat beside him. Honey, what's wrong? He shook his head, wiping his face with the back of his hand. Nothing. I'm fine. You're not fine. Talk to me, please. He turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw something raw and terrified in his eyes. Some things are harder than I expected, he said quietly. That's all. What things? The research? He looked away. I can't talk about it yet, Margaret. I'm sorry, I just need time to process everything. Process what? But he was already opening his door, already walking into the house, already closing himself in his office where I couldn't reach him. I told myself it was just stress. I told myself that academic research was complicated, that David was probably wrestling with ambiguous findings that didn't fit neatly into any narrative. I told myself that my husband of 35 years would share with me when he was ready, that our temple covenants meant something, that we were eternal companions who faced everything together. I had no idea that my husband was carrying a secret that would burn our entire world to the ground. The truth is, I might have gone on believing those comfortable lies indefinitely. I might have waited patiently for David to come back to me, trusting that whatever darkness had descended on him would eventually lift. I was, after all, an expert at trusting, an expert at waiting, an expert at believing that everything happened according to God's plan. But then came the night that changed everything. The night I stopped waiting and started looking. It was December 7th, a Thursday. David had flown to Salt Lake for what he called a consultation meeting with church leadership about the research findings. He would be gone overnight, returning Friday afternoon. After he left, I went through my usual evening routine. A light dinner, some reading, a phone call with Rachel about Christmas plans for the grandchildren. But something nagged at me. Something had been nagging at me for months, if I was honest with myself. That look in David's eyes, those hushed phone calls, the way he flinched whenever I mentioned the research. At 11 o'clock, unable to sleep, I found myself standing outside his office door. In 35 years of marriage, I had never violated David's privacy. His office was his sanctuary, the place where he worked and studied and prepared his lectures. I had always respected that boundary. But that night something broke inside me, or maybe something finally woke up. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The office was exactly as it had always been, bookshelves lined with academic texts, framed diplomas on the walls, his grandfather's antique desk beneath the window. I didn't know what I was looking for. Evidence of an affair, financial problems, some explanation for the stranger who had taken my husband's place. I started with the desk drawers, tax documents, old lecture notes, a collection of birthday cards the children had made over the years. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed the filing cabinet in the corner. David had bought it 2 years ago, claiming he needed more storage for his expanding research files. I had never thought much about it before, but now I saw that one of the drawers had a small lock on it, something I had never noticed, or perhaps something that had been added recently. I knew where David kept his spare keys. I had organized that drawer myself. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the filing cabinet. Inside, I found folders, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and location names: Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico. And beneath the folders, a thick manila envelope marked with 2 words in David's handwriting: confidential, not for public release. I opened the envelope and began to read. The first document was a summary report of DNA analysis conducted on skeletal remains from multiple archaeological sites in Mesoamerica. The language was technical, full of terms like mitochondrial haplogroups and Y chromosome markers, but the conclusion was written in plain English. Analysis confirms that all sampled populations demonstrate genetic lineage consistent with East Asian origin, specifically Siberian ancestry dating to migrations approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. No evidence of Near Eastern, Hebrew, or Mediterranean genetic markers was detected in any sample. I read the sentence 3 times, trying to understand what it meant. No Hebrew genetic markers. But the Book of Mormon clearly stated that Lehi and his family had come from Jerusalem, that they were Israelites, that their descendants were among the ancestors of the Native Americans. I kept reading. The next document was a linguistic analysis comparing Native American languages to Hebrew and Egyptian. The conclusion was equally stark. No structural, phonetic, or etymological connections can be established between any documented pre-Columbian American language and Near Eastern language families. Then came archaeological surveys, detailed reports on excavations searching for evidence of horses, cattle, wheat, barley, steel, and chariots, all things mentioned in the Book of Mormon as existing in ancient America. Page after page documented the same finding: no evidence. No horse bones from the right time period. No wheat or barley cultivation before European contact. No steel implements. No wheeled vehicles. And then I found the emails. They were printouts of correspondence between David and other researchers, as well as communications with administrators at BYU and, I realized with growing horror, officials within the church's history department. The tone of these emails was careful, diplomatic, but the message was clear. We need to discuss how to frame these findings for the broader membership. The current apologetic approaches may need to be revised in light of this data. It is essential that this information be managed carefully to avoid unnecessary faith crises. I sat on that cold floor for 3 hours, reading document after document. Each page was a knife. Each conclusion, a funeral. By the time I heard the garage door open at 2 in the morning, David returning earlier than expected, I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that room. I was holding the DNA report in my hands when he appeared in the doorway. His face went pale. "Margaret," he whispered, "I can explain." But how do you explain a lifetime of believing something that isn't true? How do you explain that the foundation of everything, our marriage, our family, our identity, our eternity, might have been built on sand? I looked at my husband, at this man I had loved and trusted and followed for 35 years, and I asked the only question that mattered: how long have you known? David stood frozen in the doorway, his coat still on, his briefcase hanging from one hand. The color had drained from his face so completely that he looked like a man confronting his own ghost. "How long have you known?" I repeated, my voice steadier than I expected. The documents were scattered around me on the floor: DNA reports, archaeological surveys, email printouts, evidence of a truth that had been kept from me, from all of us, for God knows how long. David set down his briefcase slowly, deliberately, like a man trying not to startle a wounded animal. He stepped into the office and closed the door behind him. "Margaret, please, let me explain." "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for months? That you've known our entire faith is built on what? Fabrications? Mistakes?" "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," I was shouting now, something I rarely did. In 35 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times I had raised my voice to my husband. "You've been coming home from these trips like a stranger. You've been hiding in this office, having secret phone calls, shutting me out completely. And this whole time you knew. You knew, and you said nothing." David crossed the room and lowered himself into the chair behind his desk. He looked exhausted, not just tired, but depleted in some fundamental way, like a man who had been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. "I found out on the first trip," he said quietly. "In April. Some of the preliminary findings were already coming in, and they weren't. They weren't what we expected." "What did you expect?" He looked at me with something like desperation. "I expected what I had always been taught to expect, Margaret. Evidence that supported the Book of Mormon. Artifacts that confirmed our people had been here. Genetic markers that linked Native Americans to the House of Israel." He shook his head. "But that's not what we found. That's not what anyone has ever found." "And the emails? The ones talking about how to manage this information?" David's jaw tightened. "The church has known about these problems for decades. The DNA research isn't new. Scientists have been studying Native American genetics since the 90s. The conclusions have been consistent from the beginning. No Hebrew ancestry, no connection to the Middle East. The indigenous peoples of the Americas descended from Asian populations who crossed a land bridge from Siberia thousands of years before Lehi supposedly sailed from Jerusalem." I felt the room tilt slightly. If they've known for decades, why hasn't anyone told us? Because there's no good way to tell people that the foundational narrative of their faith doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. David's voice was bitter now. So instead, they adjust. They change the introduction to the Book of Mormon from Principal Ancestors to Among the Ancestors. They publish essays on the church website that most members never read, acknowledging the problems while simultaneously suggesting that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. They fund apologetic research that reframes the questions, that suggests maybe horses meant tapirs and chariots meant something without wheels, and steel was actually a different kind of metal. "Tapirs?" I stared at him. "You're telling me that when the Book of Mormon talks about horses, the apologists say it actually means tapirs?" "Among other explanations, yes." I thought of all the times I had taught primary lessons about Nephi and his family sailing to the Promised Land. All the times I had testified of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, borne witness of its historical reality. I had taught children, my own children, my grandchildren, that these were real people who really lived, that their story was true. "What else?" I asked, my voice hollow. "What else have they known?" David hesitated. "How much do you want to know tonight, Margaret? Because once you start down this road, everything. I want to know everything." He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe relief. The relief of a man finally allowed to set down his burden. "The DNA is just one piece," he said. "There are archaeological problems. The anachronisms I mentioned. Horses, wheat, barley, steel, chariots, silk. None of these things existed in pre-Columbian America during Book of Mormon times. Archaeologists have searched for over a century, and there's simply no evidence. Maybe they just haven't found it yet." "Margaret," his tone was gentle but firm, "we found evidence of civilizations in the Americas dating back over 15,000 years. We found bones of animals that went extinct 10,000 years ago. We've mapped trade routes and migration patterns and dietary habits of ancient peoples through isotope analysis. If horses had existed in ancient America during the Book of Mormon period, we would have found evidence. We haven't. Not a single bone, not a single tooth." I wanted to argue. I wanted to find some flaw in his logic, some gap in the evidence. But David was a scholar. He had spent his entire career evaluating historical claims. If he said the evidence wasn't there, the evidence wasn't there. "What about the first vision?" I asked, grasping for something solid. "The golden plates? The witnesses?" David was quiet for a moment. "Have you ever read Joseph Smith's own accounts of the first vision?" "Of course. It's in the Pearl of Great Price. That's the 1838 account. But Joseph wrote about the vision multiple times, starting in 1832. Did you know that his earliest written account only mentions seeing one personage, Jesus Christ, not two? That he doesn't mention seeing the Father until later versions?" I shook my head slowly. This wasn't something I had ever heard in any Sunday school class or Relief Society lesson. "The accounts differ in significant details," David continued. "His age at the time of the vision. His motivation for praying. The number and identity of the beings he saw. None of this is hidden. The church has published all the accounts on its website, but most members don't know because most members have never been encouraged to look." Why would the accounts be different? There are various explanations. Memory changes over time. Emphasis shifts depending on the audience. But the fact remains that the story we tell today, two personages, the father and the son, appearing to a 14-year-old boy to announce that all churches were wrong, that specific version didn't emerge until years after the event supposedly occurred, and only after Joseph Smith faced challenges to his leadership. My mind was reeling. Every few minutes, another pillar of my faith was crumbling, and I couldn't stop it. I couldn't even slow it down. "There's more, isn't there?" David nodded slowly. "The Book of Abraham. Do you know how Joseph Smith claimed to translate it? From Egyptian papyri. The scrolls that came with the mummies." "Right. And for over a century, the church taught that Joseph translated the actual Egyptian writing on those scrolls. But when the papyri were rediscovered in 1967, fragments that had been thought lost, Egyptologists examined them, Mormon and non-Mormon scholars alike. Do you know what they found?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The papyri are standard Egyptian funerary texts, common burial documents called the Book of Breathings. They date to about 2,000 years after Abraham lived. They have nothing to do with Abraham at all. Not a single mention of him. Not a single reference to anything in the Book of Abraham. David leaned forward. "The church acknowledges this now. There's a Gospel Topics essay that admits Egyptologists agree the characters don't match the translation. They try to explain it away as inspired revelation, rather than literal translation. But Margaret, Joseph Smith himself said he was translating. He claimed the scrolls were written by Abraham's own hand. I thought of all the times I had read from the Book of Abraham, had pondered its teachings about the pre-mortal existence and the nature of God. Was it all just invented? Fabricated from scrolls that Joseph Smith couldn't actually read? And polygamy, David said quietly. I assume you know the basics. Joseph married multiple women. I know the church practiced plural marriage. It's in our history. But do you know how Joseph practiced it? David's voice was careful now, almost clinical. He married approximately 30 to 40 women. Historians debate the exact number, but somewhere in that range. Several of them were teenagers. The youngest was 14, and at least 11 of them were already married to other men. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What do you mean, already married? Polyandry. Joseph Smith married women who had living husbands. In some cases, the husbands were faithful members of the church, even leaders. Zena Huntington was 6 months pregnant with her husband's child when Joseph married her. He told her an angel with a drawn sword had commanded him to take her as a wife, and that he would be destroyed if she refused. That can't be right. That's anti-Mormon propaganda. It's in the church's own Gospel Topics essay, Margaret. They published it in 2014. They acknowledge the marriages to women with living husbands. They acknowledge the teenage brides. They acknowledge the angel with the drawn sword. It's all there, on the church's own website, available for anyone to read. Most members just don't know because they've never been told to look. I was shaking now. Not just my hands. My whole body was trembling as if I had been plunged into ice water. If stories like this resonate with you, you're not alone. Join this community by subscribing. There are many more untold stories waiting to be shared. Why didn't you tell me, I whispered, when you first found out? Why didn't you come home and tell me? David's face crumpled. For the first time since I had known him, my strong, steady husband looked broken. Because I didn't know how, he said, his voice cracking. How do you tell the woman you love that everything you built together is based on a lie? How do you look at your children, our son the bishop, our daughter raising her kids in the covenant, and tell them their entire identity is founded on claims that don't hold up to scrutiny? He wiped his eyes. I kept thinking I would find something. Some piece of evidence that would make sense of it all, that would reconcile what I was learning with what I believed. I thought if I just kept looking, kept studying, I would find a way back to faith. And did you? The silence stretched between us. No, David finally said. I didn't. Have you ever felt trapped between who you were supposed to be and who you really are? Share your experience in the comments below. I don't remember what happened next with any clarity. I remember standing up. I remember the documents falling from my lap. I remember David reaching for me, and I remember pulling away. What I remember most is lying in the guest bedroom at 4 a.m, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was floating outside my own body. The woman who had walked into David's office no longer existed. She had died on that cold floor, surrounded by papers that proved her entire life was built on fiction. But here's what I didn't understand yet, what I wouldn't understand for weeks. The worst part wasn't what the documents said. The worst part was realizing that my husband had already left the church in his heart. He had traveled to a place I didn't know existed, a place beyond faith, beyond belief. And he had gone there without me. For 35 years, we had walked the same path. We had knelt at the same altars, made the same covenants, believed the same truths. We had promised each other eternity. And now, lying alone in that guest bed while my husband sat somewhere in the darkness of our home, I realized that eternity might have been the biggest lie of all. But I wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Because even though I had seen the evidence, even though David had explained it all, some part of me still clung to the hope that there was another explanation, that the scholars were wrong, that the science was flawed, that my husband, brilliant as he was, had simply lost his way and needed me to guide him back. I decided I would do my own research. I would examine the claims for myself, and I would prove, to David, to myself, to everyone, that the church was still true. What I didn't know was that my search for answers would take me even deeper into the darkness, that every door I opened would reveal another room full of shadows, and that by the time I emerged on the other side, I wouldn't just have lost my faith, I would have lost my family. The next morning, I woke with the strange clarity that comes after a sleepless night, that hollow, electric feeling where everything seems both too sharp and slightly unreal. David had already left for campus by the time I came downstairs. He had made coffee, which he knew I didn't drink, and left a note on the counter. We should talk tonight. I love you. D. I stared at those 3 words. I love you, and wondered if they were still true. if they could still be true after everything. But I didn't have time for doubt. I had made a decision in those dark hours before dawn. I would investigate for myself. I would examine the evidence with my own eyes, apply my own reasoning, seek my own answers. David was a scholar, yes, but scholars could be wrong. They could be deceived. They could lose their way. I would find the truth. And I would bring my husband back. I started where any good Latter-day Saint would start, with approved church resources. I logged onto the church's website and navigated to the gospel topics essays David had mentioned. I had never heard of these essays before, despite being a lifelong member who considered herself well-versed in church doctrine and history. That alone troubled me. Why hadn't they been discussed in Sunday school? Why hadn't the bishop mentioned them? Why had I never seen them referenced in General Conference? The essays were buried deep in the website, accessible only if you knew exactly what to search for. I found the one on Book of Mormon and DNA studies and began to read. Within the first few paragraphs, I felt my stomach clench. The essay acknowledged, on the church's own official website, that the majority of DNA identified to date in modern native peoples most closely resembles that of Eastern Asian populations. It admitted that scientists believe the Americas were populated by migrants from Siberia who crossed a land bridge thousands of years before the Book of Mormon period. But then came the explanations, the caveats. The carefully worded suggestions that maybe the Lehites were a small group whose DNA was simply absorbed into the larger population. That maybe we shouldn't expect to find genetic evidence. That absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. I read these apologetic responses and wanted desperately to believe them. But something had shifted in me overnight. The words that would have satisfied me a week ago now felt hollow, like explanations designed not to illuminate but to obscure. I moved on to the essay about the first vision. The church actually acknowledged, that Joseph Smith left 4 different accounts of the vision. That these accounts differ in emphasis and detail. That the earliest account mentioned only one personage, not 2. That Joseph's age and motivation varied across the tellings. The essay tried to explain these discrepancies as normal variations in how people recount significant experiences. And perhaps that was true. But why had I never been told about multiple accounts? Why had I spent 50 years believing there was only one story, one version, one truth, when the reality was far more complicated? Then I found the essay on plural marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. I read about Joseph marrying women as young as 14. I read about the angel with the drawn sword, threatening destruction if Joseph didn't obey. I read about the carefully worded denials Joseph and other leaders issued publicly while practicing polygamy in secret. I read that following his marriage to Louisa Beeman and before he married other single women, Joseph Smith was sealed to a number of women who were already married. The church was admitting, in its own words, that the founder of our faith had married other men's wives, that he had done so secretly, that he had used threats of divine punishment to coerce some of these women into compliance. I pushed back from the computer and walked to the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I poured a glass of water. Outside the window, the Provo Temple gleamed white against the winter sky, serene and unchanging. I had been married in that building. I had sealed my children to me for eternity in that building. I had believed, with every fiber of my being, that the covenants made there were eternal and binding. Now I wondered what else I had believed that wasn't true. I returned to the computer. If the church's own essays confirmed these troubling facts, what else was out there? What else had been hidden in plain sight? I typed 3 words into the search bar. CES Letter, PDF. David had mentioned it once, months ago, in a dismissive tone. Anti-Mormon propaganda, he had called it. Nothing a faithful member needs to waste their time on. But now I wanted to see for myself. If it was full of lies, I would recognize them. If it contained truth, I needed to know. The document was over 100 pages long. I started reading at 10 in the morning. By 3 in the afternoon, I was still reading, my untouched lunch growing cold beside me. The CES Letter compiled every troubling issue I had already encountered, and dozens more I hadn't. The translation of the Book of Mormon using a stone in a hat, something I had never been taught in decades of church education. The multiple versions of priesthood restoration stories that, like the first vision accounts, grew more detailed and miraculous over time. The changes made to revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants years after they were supposedly received. The striking similarities between Book of Mormon passages and a book called The Late War, published in 1816. Each page pulled me deeper into a labyrinth of questions, and unlike the Gospel Topics essays, the CES Letter didn't offer comforting explanations. It simply presented the evidence and asked, "How do you explain this?" I didn't have answers. For the first time in my life, I didn't have answers. By the time David came home that evening, I had progressed from the CES Letter to academic sources. I had read papers by geneticists, examined the work of Egyptologists on the Book of Abraham, studied archaeological surveys of Mesoamerica. The more I read, the more I found the same conclusion repeated across disciplines. There was no scientific evidence supporting the historical claims of the Book of Mormon. David found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and handwritten notes. "Margaret." He stood in the doorway, still wearing his coat. "What are you doing?" "Research," I said without looking up. "The same thing you've been doing for months, except I'm not hiding it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from me. "What have you found?" "You know what I've found. You've known for a year." I finally met his eyes. The DNA evidence is real. The archaeological problems are real. The issues with the Book of Abraham, David Egyptologists have been saying for over a century that Joseph's translation is completely wrong, not just slightly off, completely, demonstrably wrong. How did we not know this? We didn't know because we weren't supposed to know. The information was always available, but it was never integrated into our religious education. We were taught to avoid anti-Mormon literature. We were taught that doubt was a sin, that questions were a sign of weak faith. We were taught to stay on the covenant path and not stray into forbidden territory. David's voice was weary. The system is designed to prevent exactly what you're doing right now. I thought of all the times I had warned my children away from anti-Mormon sources. All the times I had counseled struggling ward members to simply pray harder, study the scriptures more, trust in the prophets. I had been a gatekeeper for a system that kept people in the dark. "What do we do now?" I asked. David shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I've been asking myself that question for months." That night we talked until the early hours of the morning, not about evidence or research, but about our family, about what this would mean for Thomas, who had built his entire identity around church leadership, about Rachel, who was raising her children in the same faith we now questioned, about Michael and Peter, both returned missionaries, both sealed in the temple. "We can't tell them," I said. "Not yet. I need more time to process this." "Margaret, we have to tell them eventually. They deserve to know what we've learned. What we've learned could destroy them. Thomas is a bishop. Do you understand what this would do to him, to his family, to his standing in the community?" "I understand, but we can't keep lying to them forever." I flinched at the word lying. Because that's what it was, wasn't it? Every time I bore my testimony, every time I taught a lesson, every time I smiled and said the church was true, it was a lie. Or at least a statement I could no longer make with certainty. We decided to wait, to give ourselves time to work through our own crisis before involving our children. It seemed like the compassionate choice. It was also a mistake. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, we hosted our monthly family dinner. Thomas and Jennifer came with their 3 children. Rachel and Derek brought the grandkids. Michael drove up from Salt Lake with his wife. Only Peter was absent, stuck at work in California. I moved through the afternoon like an actress in a play, performing the role of faithful mother and grandmother. I helped Jennifer set the table. I listened to Rachel talk about the young women's camp she was planning. I watched Thomas bless the food with the same priesthood authority I had once revered. But everything felt different now. Every prayer, every reference to the gospel, every casual assumption of shared belief. It all felt like a language I no longer spoke fluently. I was an outsider in my own family, a stranger at my own table. After dinner, while the grandchildren played in the living room, Thomas pulled me aside. "Mom, can we talk for a minute?" We stepped into David's office, the same office where my world had collapsed 3 weeks earlier. Thomas closed the door behind us. "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" he asked. "You both seem off lately." "We're fine, honey. Just tired. Your father's been traveling a lot for work." Thomas studied me with the same intense gaze his father had. "There's something else, I can tell." I hesitated. This was my son, my firstborn, the child I had rocked and prayed over and raised in the gospel. I had never lied to him about anything important, but I also knew what the truth would cost him. "I've been struggling with some things," I finally said. "Some questions about church history, things I've been reading." Thomas's expression shifted. "What kind of things?" "The DNA research on Native Americans, the Book of Abraham translation, the multiple accounts of the first vision." I watched his face carefully. "Have you heard about any of this?" "I've heard of it," Thomas said, and something in his tone made my heart sink. "Those are anti-Mormon talking points, Mom. Satan uses partial truths to deceive even the elect. You know that." "But they're not partial truths. The church itself acknowledges these issues. There are essays on the official website." The Gospel Topics essays exist to help people who've been exposed to anti-Mormon material. They're not meant for faithful members who don't have doubts. Thomas took my hands in his. "Mom, this is exactly what the adversary does. He targets the strongest testimonies. He plants seeds of doubt in the minds of the most faithful." I felt tears welling in my eyes. What if the doubts are based on facts? What if the questions have real answers that don't support what we've been taught? Thomas's grip on my hands tightened. "There are answers. There are always faithful answers. You just have to trust the prophets and stay on the covenant path. Have you prayed about this? Have you fasted?" "I've prayed every day for weeks." "And what has the Spirit told you?" I couldn't answer. Because the truth was, I didn't know anymore. I couldn't distinguish between the Spirit and my own emotions. I couldn't tell if the feeling I had once called burning in the bosom was divine communication or simply the comfort of familiar beliefs. Thomas released my hands and stepped back. His expression had changed, hardened somehow, become more formal. "I think you should talk to President Morrison," he said. "Schedule a meeting with the stake president. Get a priesthood blessing. This is a spiritual attack, Mom, and you need spiritual weapons to fight it." "And if I don't?" The question hung between us. Thomas's face flickered with something I had never seen before. A coldness. A distance. "Then I'll be very concerned about you," he said quietly. "And I'll have to consider what's best for my family." I understood what he wasn't saying. If I pursued this path, if I kept asking questions, if I let my doubts lead me away from the church, I could lose him. I could lose my grandchildren. I could lose everything. Thomas opened the office door. "I should get back to Jennifer and the kids. But Mom, please, pray about this, fast about this. Don't let Satan win." He walked away, leaving me alone in the room where everything had started. I looked at my husband, at this man I had loved and trusted and followed for 35 years, and I realized the worst part wasn't what the documents said. The worst part was that my son wasn't worried about my soul. He was worried about his position. And in that moment, I saw the church's true power. It had taught my own child to choose reputation over his mother. Thomas told the stake president. I don't know exactly what he said, but 3 days after our conversation, I received a phone call from President Morrison's executive secretary asking if I could come in for a visit. The word they used was visit, as if we were old friends catching up over lemonade. But I knew what it really was. An intervention. David refused to go. He had already made his peace with leaving, even if he hadn't formalized it yet. But I wasn't ready for that. Some part of me still hoped there was a way to reconcile what I had learned with what I had always believed. Some part of me still wanted someone in authority to sit me down and explain it all away, to give me the faithful answers Thomas had promised existed. So I went alone. President Morrison's office was exactly what you would expect. A large mahogany desk, portraits of prophets on the walls, scriptures arranged prominently on a shelf. He was a kind-faced man in his 60s, a retired attorney, someone I had known casually for years through stake functions and temple sessions. He wasn't alone. His two counselors sat on either side of him, forming a wall of priesthood authority. 3 men in dark suits, waiting to save my soul. Sister Holloway, President Morrison began, gesturing for me to sit across from them. Thank you for coming in. We understand you've been struggling with some questions about church history. I've been doing research, I said carefully, reading the gospel topics essays, studying the sources they cite, trying to understand some issues I wasn't aware of before. The counselors exchanged glances. President Morrison leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. We understand that some of this information can be troubling when encountered without proper context. That's why we're here, to help provide that context, to answer your questions, and to support you through this challenge to your faith. I had prepared for this moment. I had brought notes, specific questions with specific citations, all from church-approved or academically verified sources. I pulled the papers from my purse. I'd like to understand the DNA evidence, I said. The church's own essay acknowledges that Native American DNA shows no connection to the Middle East. How do we reconcile that with the Book of Mormon's claim that the Lamanites are the ancestors of the American Indians? President Morrison nodded slowly. The essay addresses this. The Lehite colony was likely a small group whose genetic signature was absorbed into the larger indigenous population. We shouldn't expect to find their DNA preserved after thousands of years of intermixing. But the introduction to the Book of Mormon called them the principal ancestors until 2006. Prophets and apostles taught for over a century that Native Americans were literal descendants of Lehi. Were they wrong? A longer pause. Prophets are human. They sometimes speak as men, not as prophets. Our understanding evolves over time as we receive further light and knowledge. So, how do we know which teachings are prophetic and which are just men speaking as men? How do we know what to believe? The room fell silent. The counselors shifted uncomfortably. President Morrison's kind expression had become something more fixed, more careful. Sister Holloway, these are the kinds of questions that lead people away from the covenant path. The Spirit is our guide. When we feel the burning of the Holy Ghost, we know something is true. That's the promise of Moroni's challenge. But I've felt that burning while reading things that turned out to be factually incorrect. I've felt spiritual confirmations of testimonies that were based on incomplete information. How do I trust those feelings now? President Morrison sat back in his chair. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. Still kind, but with an edge of warning beneath it. Faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting in God even when we don't understand. The gospel is not on trial here. Our testimonies are not meant to be subjected to the same scrutiny we would apply to a legal case or a scientific hypothesis. These are spiritual matters, and they require spiritual witnesses. I looked at the 3 men across from me, educated, successful, respected leaders in the community. Men who had built their lives and identities around the same faith I was now questioning. I realized they couldn't help me, not because they were unwilling, but because they were unable. To truly engage with my questions would require them to face the same abyss I was staring into, and they weren't ready for that. They might never be ready. Some things aren't meant to be understood in this life, President Morrison continued. That's what faith is for. I sat there for a moment, watching 3 men in suits dismiss decades of scientific evidence with a single sentence about faith, and I understood something I had never understood before. This was never about truth. It was about control. They didn't want members who searched. They wanted members who stayed. I gathered my papers and stood up. Thank you for your time, President, I said. I appreciate your concern. Sister Holloway. His voice stopped me at the door. We hope you'll reconsider the path you're on. Your family needs you. Your ward needs you. The kingdom of God needs faithful women like you. I turned to look at him one last time. What the kingdom of God needs, I said quietly. is honesty. Then I walked out of his office and into the cold December air. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to the Provo Temple, the place where I had been married, where I had sealed my children, where I had spent hundreds of hours doing proxy baptisms and endowments and sealings. I parked in the lot and sat there, staring at the white spires against the gray winter sky. For 58 years, this building had represented everything sacred in my life: eternity, family. The promise that death was not the end, that the bonds we formed in mortality would stretch into infinity. I had believed it with every fiber of my being. Now I wondered what it actually was. A beautiful building where sincere people performed rituals that gave them comfort and community. Not a portal to celestial glory, not a house of God in any literal sense, just stone and mortar and good intentions. I thought about my life. Every choice I had made, my mission, my marriage, my children, my callings, had been shaped by beliefs I now doubted. I had devoted myself to an institution that had kept me in the dark about its own history. I had taught my children to trust prophets who had been wrong about fundamental things. I had spent decades defending a book that had no archaeological, genetic, or linguistic support. What did I have left? I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, watching temple workers come and go in their white clothing. They looked peaceful, certain, exactly the way I had looked a few months ago. I envied them, and I pitied them, and I didn't know which feeling was more appropriate. If this story moved you and you'd like to support more content like this, there's a link in the description and pinned comment where you can buy me a coffee. Every contribution helps keep these stories alive. That night, David and I made our decision. We would request to have our names removed from church records. We would tell our children. We would face whatever consequences came. It did not go well. Thomas stopped speaking to us almost immediately. He informed us, through Jennifer, that until we repented and returned to the fold, he could not allow his children to be exposed to our apostate influence. My grandchildren, the ones I had held as infants, had watched take their first steps, had helped prepare for baptism, were suddenly forbidden from visiting Grammy and Grandpa. Rachel was more conflicted. She cried when we told her, asked 1,000 questions, begged us to reconsider. But she also had a husband who was a counselor in his bishopric, a social world built entirely around church membership, children enrolled in seminary. She couldn't risk her own standing by maintaining close ties to apostates. "I love you, Mom," she told me on the phone, her voice thick with tears. "But I have to think about my kids. I have to think about what's best for them spiritually." Michael and Peter fell somewhere in between, hurt, confused, willing to maintain some contact but wary of discussing anything related to our departure. Family dinners became infrequent and awkward. Conversations stayed carefully on the surface. The community response was equally predictable. Friends of 30 years stopped calling. Neighbors who had once dropped by for visits now avoided eye contact at the grocery store. My visiting teachers, women I had served alongside for decades, were reassigned to other sisters. I received a letter informing me that I was no longer welcome to teach or participate in any church activities. In the space of a few months, we lost almost everything: our social network, our community standing, our relationships with our children and grandchildren, the entire framework of meaning and belonging that had structured our lives for nearly 6 decades. And yet, 6 months after we submitted our resignation letters, I woke one morning to find sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, and I realized something had changed. The weight I had been carrying, the constant anxiety of managing beliefs against evidence, of suppressing questions, of performing faith I no longer felt, it was gone. I got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the world looked the same as it always had. The mountains in the distance, the neighbor's tree dropping its leaves. An ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary life. But I was not the same. I had lost my faith, yes, but I had found something else. Something I didn't have a name for yet. David came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. We stood there in silence, watching the morning light spread across the valley. "How are you feeling?" he asked. I considered the question. How was I feeling? Sad? Sometimes. Angry? Often. Grieving for relationships that might never heal? For decades spent believing things that weren't true? but also something else. Something that felt like the first breath of fresh air after years in a closed room. Free, I finally said. I feel free. It wasn't the ending I would have chosen. I would never have chosen to lose my son, to be estranged from my grandchildren, to become a cautionary tale whispered about in Relief Society meetings. I would never have chosen to dismantle the entire framework of meaning I had spent a lifetime constructing. But I had learned something in those terrible months of research and discovery and loss. I had learned that there is a rhythm to belief and doubt, to belonging and becoming. The same heart that broke when I read those documents was the heart that finally started beating for itself. I thought about all the other Margarets out there, women sitting in church pews with questions they were afraid to ask, women lying awake at night wondering if their doubts made them broken, women choosing silence over honesty because the cost of truth seemed too high. I wished I could tell them what I had learned, that the fear of questioning is worse than the questioning itself, that the institution designed to save your soul might also be the cage keeping it captive, that you can lose everything you thought defined you and still find yourself on the other side, whole and breathing and finally, truly alive. I didn't lose my faith. I lost a cage I had mistaken for wings, and on the other side of everything I was taught to fear, I found a version of myself I had never met. She had been waiting there all along, patient and persistent, surviving decades of suppression and silence. She was worth the journey. A year has passed since that night in David's office. Thomas still doesn't speak to us, though Jennifer sometimes sends photos of the grandchildren on holidays. Rachel has started asking questions of her own. Quiet questions late at night when Derek is asleep. I don't push her. I just answer honestly when she asks, and I wait. David and I have found a community of others like us, people who left the church and are rebuilding their lives, their relationships, their sense of meaning. We meet in coffee shops and living rooms, sharing our stories, supporting each other through the grief and the growth. It's not the same as what we lost, but it's real, and it's ours. Last week, I received a letter from a woman I had never met. She had heard my story through a friend of a friend. She was a lifelong member, a mother of 5, a Relief Society president in a ward in Idaho. And she was terrified because she had started reading the Gospel Topics essays and couldn't stop. "How did you survive it?" she asked. "How do you keep going when everything you believe turns out to be wrong?" I wrote back the only truth I know. You don't survive by pretending the questions don't exist. You survive by walking through them. It will hurt. You will lose things you never imagined losing. But on the other side of the pain, there is something waiting for you. Not the certainty you once had. That's gone forever. But something better. Something truer. Yourself. I sealed the envelope and walked it to the mailbox. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. In the distance, the Provo Temple glowed white against the darkening horizon. I looked at it for a long moment, that building where I had made promises I once thought would last forever. Then I turned and walked back to my house, to my husband, to the strange and beautiful life we were building in the ruins of our faith. The truth doesn't destroy you. It releases you, and she's waiting. That version of yourself you've never met. She's worth the journey. I'd love to know. What moment in this story hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments.